Good afternoon, and thanks to all of you for being here, for joining us today for this hearing of the Joint Economic Committee. The American economy is thriving. The current economic expansion is the longest in U.S. history. Our unemployment rate has remained below 4% over the last 18 months. In recent years, we've seen consistently solid GDP growth and growth in job creation. And yet, notwithstanding these successes, for many parents across this country, raising a family has become harder and more expensive than ever before. The New York Times, in fact, recently reported that based on the surveyed adults between the ages of 20 to 45 who were parents or who planned to be, they discovered some interesting trends. 1 in 4 had fewer children or expected that during their lifetimes they would have fewer children than they considered to be within the range of ideal. Economic concerns were foremost among the reasons that they either fell short or believed that in the future they would fall short of what they considered ideal. Over the past few years, the Joint Economic Committee's Social Capital Project has been documenting trends in what we refer to as our associational life as Americans. That is, the web of social relationships through which we as Americans pursue various endeavors, our families, our communities, our friendships, our religious congregations, for example. A critical source of meaning and social capital is, of course, the family. In fact, it is the central set of headwaters for social connectedness generally. That's why 2 of the project's main policy objectives are making it more affordable to raise a family and increasing the number of children who are raised by happily married parents. The goals of today's hearing are to examine factors affecting family affordability and to explore policy approaches that might allow for more Americans to start and to raise the families that they desire. Increasingly, family affordability has become a unifying concern among lawmakers and policymakers and commentators of both the political right and of the political left and everything in between. Even we hear it even in discussions around topics that are as varied as the child tax credit, as declining fertility rates, increases in the cost of child care and of housing, paid family leave, and student debt burdens. Motivating all these discussions is a simple statement. It should not be this hard to raise a family. The problem is, of course, multifaceted. It is complex. It's difficult to unravel and to understand completely. Economic challenges such as debt loads and increases in the cost of living make family formation and expansion difficult for many Americans. Even many families that are economically stable have to deal with the challenges of balancing work and family. Parents want to afford the best neighborhoods and schools for their children, but that often leads to too little time to spend with them, less time at least than they would prefer. As more families have sent 2 earners into the workforce, employers have been slow to accommodate their desire for work-life balance. Meanwhile, Americans who might prefer something closer to a single breadwinner family face prices for housing and other expenses that are bid up by dual-earner households, and the growing ranks of single parents are hampered by their correspondingly high poverty rates. The answer to how did we get here is complicated. Our first step must be to adequately diagnose the problems facing our families. What fuels the rising costs of health care, of childcare, of education, and of housing? How many people are hindered in family formation and expansion by excessive student loan debt, inadequate income, or poor employment prospects? To what extent does declining fertility reflect changing preferences, economic barriers, or other factors? And does the rise of the dual-earner family signal increasing hardship or simply changing values? The next step must be to come up with some solutions. What's the best way to help more families afford time out of the workforce to care for newborns? Are there ways to increase work-family flexibility that are minimally disruptive to employers and less likely than others to discourage job creation? Are the government policies that unintentionally have contributed to increases in the cost of housing, of higher education, and health care, which of those can be reformed? How can we make the tax code fairer to parents who bear the costs of supporting future generations of Americans? How is it that we can make sure that we have the workforce and the taxpayer base necessary to fund not only the programs of today, but the programs of 20, 30, 40 years from now? Our panelists today will discuss some of these topics and more. I look forward to their testimonies and to a productive conversation aimed at helping parents and strengthening our families. I now recognize Vice Chair Maloney for her opening remarks.
Thank you so much to our panelists and Chairman Lee for calling this hearing. Nothing's more important than our families. And thank you for shining a spotlight on the challenges facing American families. We can agree there is a problem. Today, millions of American families are working longer and harder, not to get ahead, but just to stay in place. And over the past 4 decades, wages have been stuck or have barely increased. Meanwhile, the cost of childcare, education, housing, and other necessities for families have grown. Most families rely on 2 incomes just to make ends meet, because that's what it takes to support an American family today. Nearly 40% of American adults report that they or their families have trouble paying for at least one basic need, like food, health care, housing, or utilities. The picture is no brighter when you look at specific costs. Take child care. The average cost of center-based infant care is more than 1/4 of median household income for single working parents. That means that those who need child care the most can't afford it. Or look at college education, which is almost a necessity in today's economy. I'd say it is a necessity. But since the 1980s, the average cost of a full-time undergraduate degree has more than tripled for public and private institutions. Today's typical graduate leaves college with $30,000 in debt. Or look at housing. Home prices are higher than ever and often out of reach. And over 1/3 of renters spend more than 30% of their overall income on rent. How are families responding to stagnant wages and growing costs? By taking on debt. Consumer debt, excluding mortgages, is now $4 trillion, the highest level ever, adjusting after inflation. Folks are also putting off home ownership, which can deprive them of a key source of wealth accumulation. Everyone in this room agrees that it's more expensive than ever to raise a family, but we may disagree about the causes and we may disagree about the solutions. I welcome the robust discussion that this committee provides. The entrance of women in the workforce is not a problem. We may hear that Americans got married less frequently or later in life as women took on careers, and that has hurt fertility rates. But women have become key drivers of our economic success. Women's earnings boost the economy by trillions of dollars and are critical to American families. Women's share of household earnings increased from 36% in '93 to 45% in 2016. Women could do even more if we made it easier for them to enter and stay in the workplace and had more flexibility, as the chairman mentioned, at the workplace. There are 2 key, overwhelming, popular ways to do that. Offer affordable child care and paid leave for the birth of a child and for work for reasons such as illness. Let's take a lesson from other OECD countries that provide these services and have significantly higher female labor force participation. And while we're at it, let's make sure that women are paid fairly so they have strong incentives to work. On average, a woman working full-time year-round earns just 80% of her male counterpart for the same. For Black and Hispanic women, it's far worse. For too many, the American dream is slipping away or is completely out of reach. Some would say that the solution is for the federal government to do nothing. I disagree. It has a key role to play in helping to restore that dream. What can it do? What can Congress do? Let's start by lifting the minimum wage. The House has passed legislation to lift the wage to $15 by 2025 and give 33 million Americans a raise. It's time for the Senate to follow suit. We should expand programs and initiatives that we know work, like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. The EITC substantially increases employment among single mothers and reduces poverty levels for their families. We should make the Child Tax Credit fully refundable to allow the poorest families to receive the full benefit. The Working Families Tax Relief Act, which expands both the EITC and CTC, would benefit 49 million children, including 2.7 million from my home state of New York. And we should strengthen the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. SNAP not only provides a healthy foundation for America's current and future workforce, it is also an investment in our economy. Every dollar of SNAP generates more than $1.50 in increased GDP. And finally, we should join the rest of the world and promote paid leave for the birth of a child. There are only 2 countries in the world that do not provide paid leave for the birth of a child: America and Papua New Guinea. And my bill, which was included in the National Defense Authorization Act that passed the House this summer, is a good start. It would provide 12 weeks of paid leave to federal employees, a model for the rest of the country to follow, hopefully, after the birth or adoption of a child, or to care for a family member who has serious illness or for illness yourself. Raising a family is hard and rewarding work. We need to do more to provide workers with tools to balance their work and family responsibilities. I appreciate the chairman's statement on flex time, how that would be very helpful for families. Today's hearing and our witnesses' testimony will shed light on the actions we can take to make raising a family more affordable. It is incredibly important for the future of America, for the future of American families, and for the American dream. And I yield back.
Thank you, Vice Chair Maloney. I'd now like to introduce our distinguished panel of witnesses. Before I do that, I want to just address a couple of housekeeping matters. This is a joint committee of both members of the House of Representatives and of the Senate. As fate would have it, both the Senate and the House of Representatives have decided to call votes right in the middle of this hearing. And so you may see members of the House and of the Senate leaving and coming back. That has nothing to do with anything other than a responsibility to continue to vote while our colleagues are voting. Members of this committee, particularly those who are here, are very interested in this hearing. We will be here for every bit of time that we possibly can. I didn't want anyone to be alarmed when they see members filtering in and out. I'd like to introduce our witnesses now. First, we have Mr. Lyman Stone, who's adjunct fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and research fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. Mr. Stone has written on migration, population dynamics, and regional economics. His work has been covered in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and numerous local outlets. Welcome, Mr. Stone. Next, we have Mr. Ryan Byrne, who is the R. Scharf Chair for the Public Understanding of Economics at the Cato Institute. Prior to his role at Cato, Mr. Byrne was head of public policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs and head of economic research at the Center for Policy Studies in the UK. Mr. Byrne has written on a number of economic issues such as fiscal policy, inequality, minimum wages, and rent control, and he's appeared on BBC News, CNN, and Sky News. He also writes weekly columns for the Daily Telegraph and the London paper City AM. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Byrne. Next, we have Dr. Jane Waldvogel, who is the Compton Foundation Centennial Professor for the Prevention of Children's and Youth Problems at Columbia University's School of Social Work, and the co-director of the Columbia Population Research Center. Dr. Waldvogel has written extensively on the impact of public policy on the well-being of children and families. Her work is focused on work-family policies, inequality in early childhood, childhood care and education, poverty, social mobility, and the black-white achievement gap. She's the author of 8 books and has published numerous articles in peer-reviewed academic journals. Welcome, Dr. Waldvogel. And we have Ms. Kristen Rowe Finkbinder, who is the Executive Director, CEO, and co-founder of an organization called Moms Rising. Dr. Finkbeiner has been involved in public policy and grassroots engagement for over 2 decades and has received numerous awards for her work. She's also an award-winning author of books and articles, a frequent public speaker, media contributor, and host of the radio program Breaking Through with Kristen Rowe Finkbeiner, powered by Moms Rising. Thank you, Ms. Rowe Finkbeiner. And we thank all of you for joining us today. We look forward to hearing your testimony, and we'll now hear from you in the order in which you were introduced. Go ahead, Mr. Stone. Yeah, just hit the button until it turns red.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Vice Chairman. It's an honor to be here today to testify on topics that are important to American families. I am affiliated with the American Enterprise Institute and the Institute for Family Studies. However, for my testimony today, the views offered are solely my own. Most of my written testimony discusses fairly concrete questions of family affordability. And the upshot is that, contrary to popular narratives, child rearing in America is not really that much more expensive than in the past. Some elements of raising a family have gotten more expensive, but the evidence suggests that the problem facing families is not simply a budget crunch. According to a wide variety of surveys, the average American woman says she wants to have around 2.3 to 2.5 children. This value has been approximately stable for 30 years. And yet, if current birth rates hold, the average young American woman today will only end up having about 1.7 children. That means that for every 10 women in America, there will be about 6 missing children. This is a new problem. From 1990 to 2007, the fertility gap was consistently just 1/3 as large. So what's going on? Instead of affordability, we should be discussing achievability. What is holding people back from having the family they reliably say they want in surveys? The answer is basically marriage. Increasingly postponed marriage can account for at least half of the increase in the fertility gap over the last decade and virtually 100% of the increase since 2000. But incentivizing marriage is a tricky question in a diverse society. Americans are justifiably uncomfortable with being lectured about getting hitched by anyone, especially the federal government. But luckily, there are some good policy options available. First of all, it must be said, the federal government already has a marriage policy. And that policy is this: working class people should not get married, but middle class and wealthy people should. This is the policy stance of the tax code, of our welfare programs, of almost everything the government does. The tax code gives you a handy marriage bonus if you have a CEO in the family, as their spouse is unlikely to earn an equivalent amount, and our tax brackets are of greatest benefit to families with the most lopsided spousal incomes. But if you get the EITC, getting married could reduce your benefit by thousands of dollars. For 2 working-class people with similar incomes, there's a very real tax on marriage. In my written testimony, I show how the marriage penalty can amount to 15 or even 25% of a family's income. It's no mystery why working-class Americans are getting married less. To be clear, the problem here is not government benefits per se, but their eligibility rules that discourage working-class people from marrying. And the result is neighborhoods with scattered families, inconsistent fathers, overworked mothers, and diminished opportunity for children, and additionally, fewer kids overall. So there's a very real way to make family life more achievable. Fix the massive government bias against marriage, and especially working-class marriage. The second response to the marriage-first explanation for decreased family achievement is to reconsider our justifications for policies like the child tax credit. The justification for the child tax credit is not that parents are inherently cash-strapped, but rather that parenting is inherently valuable to society. In other words, we should have a parenting wage because parenting is important work, and workers deserve to be paid. How we provide such a wage may vary, but we as a society should treat parents more generously than we presently do, and in a way that explicitly communicates to parents that we see parenting as worthy labor. When societies provide a parenting wage, the fertility gap shrinks. Now, if there's not also a change in marriage norms and behavior, fertility rates won't rise by a lot. So the best strategy is a 1-2 punch. For family achievability to improve in America, it's vital that we, 1, end penalties for working-class marriage, while 2, increasing our social commitment to the work of parenting by providing a parenting wage. And whatever happens to fertility rates, the children who are born into a society of greater opportunity, healthier families, and which engages in a valuable public catechesis. Parenting matters. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. Ensuring that a family can be raised affordably in America should be an uncontroversial public policy objective. Yet government policies at the federal, state, and local levels today raise prices of basic goods and services to the disproportionate financial detriment of poor households and families with children. Households across the income spectrum spend large amounts on goods and services that at their most basic should be considered necessities. Items such as food, shelter, transport, clothing, utilities, and often childcare. The average household in the poorest 20% by income allocates 57% of its spending towards shelter, food, transport, and clothing alone. The average married family with young children allocates 53%. Any meaningful analysis of family affordability must therefore consider the determinants of prices in these and other important product markets. In recent years, housing and childcare affordability have become particularly pertinent political issues, given their high toll on family budgets. High housing and childcare prices are often deemed market failures, necessitating corrective government intervention, price controls, or subsidies. But in both those markets, existing government regulations actively constrain supply, in turn raising prices. Extensive academic work has shown how overly restrictive local land use planning and zoning laws constrain new housing building, particularly in major cities. As demand for housing rises, an unresponsive supply of homes drives up the market price of housing services, forcing downsizing, longer commutes, or higher rents and mortgage payments on poorer families. Lesser known is the state-level childcare staffing regulations, notably restrictive staff-to-child ratios and qualification requirements for workers, which reduce the supply of childcare centres in poorer areas, driving up prices and reducing formal care options for families. Again and again, one finds the same pattern of government policies increasing prices. The federal sugar program, milk marketing orders, and ethanol mandates raise the price of families' groceries. Federal fuel standard regulations and state-level automobile dealership laws inflate the cost of driving. Protectionist tariffs raise retail clothing and footwear prices, and state occupational licensing laws create barriers to entry for workers, raising the prices of services from hair braiding to dentistry. My research has sought to aggregate the price effects of all of those policies stated. Using very cautious assumptions, I find that combined, they raise prices faced by typical poor families by anywhere between $830 and $3,500 per year directly. That's between 7 and 30% of average after-tax income for households in the bottom quintile. Nor is that list comprehensive of the regulatory areas where government action raises prices. And it also doesn't consider the potentially huge indirect costs. We know, for example, that elevated housing, childcare, and transport costs make it more physically and financially difficult for families to access jobs with higher wages. Undoing the worst of these price-inflating regressive regulations could therefore benefit poor families considerably. For example, estimates suggest that relaxing the average mandated staff-to-child ratio by just one child across all age groups could reduce childcare prices by 10% or more. Addressing government policies that drive high prices at source would also dampen the demands we see for risky rent control measures, affordable housing mandates, higher minimum wages, government-subsidized childcare, and new tax credits or expanded allowances. My main message today is therefore simple. Before proposing new or expanded federal programs, we should acknowledge that important pro-market reform levers already exist to improve family affordability, particularly at the state and local levels of government. These regulatory changes, especially in housing and childcare, would not require yet more federal borrowing, nor do they come with the risks associated with wage and price controls. Such an agenda may not be the full or final answer to the challenge you're considering, but again, before reaching for new programs or regulation, we should at least attempt to undo the harm caused by existing interventions.
You should also be warned, there's never a moment here if you're not on a bunch of television sets. So even if you're not here, you're going to have lots of folks watching. Just a little warning, having learned the hard way.
We should probably make that clear to our colleagues. Huh?
Senator, thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you all for being here today. So having come in late, okay, Ms. Fogel, please continue your testimony. And Ms. Finkbeiner, you're next? Okay, go right ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I've spent the past 25 years studying policies to support families and promote child well-being, especially for the 11.5 million children in poverty and the 27 million just above the poverty line. Much of my recent work uses the Census Bureau's new supplemental poverty measure, which allows us for the first time to gauge the anti-poverty effects of the full range of policies that Congress has enacted. That work makes it clear that two sets of policies are critically important. Refundable tax credits, the ITC and the child tax credit, move 4.5 million children out of poverty. SNAP and other food and nutrition programs move 2.4 million children out of poverty. We also have good evidence that these policies reduce family stress and improve child health and development. But income poverty is not the only challenge that families face. Since 2012, with the support of the Robin Hood Foundation, our group at Columbia has been surveying New York City residents. We find that poverty is just the tip of the iceberg. While 1.6 million New Yorkers are poor, 4.4 million face poverty or material hardship or serious health challenges. So it's not just families below the poverty line who struggle to put food on the table, pay their bills, or cope with ill health. So what can we do to better support American families? We need to start by recognizing that the majority no longer have a stay-at-home caregiver, but our public policies have not kept pace with this reality. The Family and Medical Leave Act still provides only unpaid leave to only 60% of the workforce. Federal child care subsidies reach only 15% of low-income families who need them. Employer policies address some of the gap, but mostly for more advantaged employees. While 40% have access to some paid family leave, those who are low-income, part-time, or Hispanic are much less likely to be covered. Only a tiny share, about 10%, receive any help from employers to pay for child care. But we know from a large body of research that these policies matter. When employees have access to paid family leave, they're much more likely to be employed. They have higher earnings. Mothers are less likely to be depressed. They breastfeed for longer. Fathers are more likely to be engaged in caring for children. Infant mortality and hospitalizations fall. Opinion surveys consistently show that Americans favor paid family and medical leave. These policies are also endorsed by employers. My colleagues and I have been surveying employers in states with these laws, including small employers who are often missing from such surveys. In 3 states with paid leave laws, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and New York, we found that 2/3 of employers were supportive of them. The evidence on child care is also extensive and clear. High-quality child care improves children's health, their cognitive development, their social development, especially for disadvantaged children. Yet too few Americans can afford it, especially in early childhood. When more subsidies are available, parents are more likely to be employed, reducing poverty and promoting family stability. Our estimates suggest that universal child care could reduce poverty by 1/3 among families paying for child care. But we also need to look at what government can do to help families where a parent is not working or not able to work enough hours. Public programs like SNAP and private programs like food pantries play a crucial role, but families also need cash to buy their children clothing and school supplies, pay rent and utilities. For this reason, virtually all our peer countries have some form of universal child allowance or child benefit, paid monthly or more frequently to all families with children. Our child tax credit is the closest policy we have to this, but unfortunately leaves out the lowest income for whom it would have the biggest impact. Indeed, 23 million American children, 1 in 3, live in families who earn too little to receive the full child tax credit of $2,000 per child that was authorized under the recent Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This includes over half of Black and Hispanic children and close to half of young children and rural children. So in summary, while there's ample evidence about the critical role of safety net policies like the EITC, the Child Tax Credit, and SNAP, as well as the efforts of groups like Robin Hood, it's also clear that we need to do more. It's high time we joined our peers in providing paid family and medical leave, quality affordable child care, and a universal child allowance.
Go ahead, Ms. Finkbeiner.
Thank you, Chairman Lee, Vice Chairwoman Maloney, and members of the Joint Economic Committee. I'm Kristen Rao Finkbeiner, Executive Director of Moms Rising, an organization with over 1 million members, including members in every state working to increase family economic security. We are on the front lines of this crisis facing America. Experts agree. It's getting more and more expensive to raise a family, and that has dire consequences. Our country, our workforce, and our economy have changed, but our policies are woefully out of date, and families are suffering as a result. And good news, this crisis is solvable, and the policies Moms Rising supports will boost families and our economy alike. The work we do lifts dads, grandparents, people with all types of families, and, of course, moms. The situation is urgent. At Moms Rising, we hear from people experiencing this crisis each day. Stories like this one. Jamie and her husband juggled 3 part-time jobs between the two of them, and even then couldn't afford childcare. Jamie could only work when her husband was home with their toddler, and until they started getting SNAP, their 4-year-old and Jamie herself often had to go without healthy food. Nobody, let alone anyone holding multiple jobs, should struggle to put food on the table. But too many families face stark choices like Jamie's. A full 1 in 6 children in our country now live in food-insecure households. You see, Jamie isn't alone. 1 in 3 households are now paying more than 30% of their incomes for housing, and more than half are renters. College tuition has tripled since the 1980s, and student debt now exceeds $1 trillion. Childcare now costs more than public college in most states, and Black and Latinx families often end up having to spend more of their income on childcare than anyone else. Meredith from Florida and her husband planned for years, but still ended up with student loans, health care, childcare, and housing costs that made it hard to stay afloat. Their student loans cost as much as a car payment. They paid $1,000 per month for childcare. They live with her parents to try to save money. The terrible truth is that as costs and net productivity have been rising, wages have been largely stuck for decades. This means wealth inequality is increasing, the racial wealth gap is persisting, and most people raising children in America are facing a financial crunch. On top of this, women are being pushed even further behind by wage, hiring, and advancement discrimination. Women of all races on average are paid just 80 cents on a man's dollar, and moms of all races on average experienced increased wage discrimination, earning an average of just 71 cents to a dad's dollar, with moms of color paid even less due to structural racism. This is happening despite studies showing a direct correlation between high levels of women in corporate leadership and higher profits. Families urgently need women's wages, as does our economy. Women became half of the full-time labor force in the last decade, and 3/4 of moms are now in the labor force, more than half of whom are the primary breadwinners. Further, in our consumer-fueled economy, women and moms make nearly 3/4 of purchasing decisions. So when women aren't paid fairly and don't have funds to spend, our entire economy suffers. It's long past time to move our policies into the 21st century to match our modern labor force so families and our economy can thrive. We need to address these challenges from multiple angles: better, fairer wages, updates to our outdated policies, and we need to make basic necessities more affordable. And good news, there's growing momentum for policy change that solves many of these issues. For instance, dozens of states and municipalities are passing paid family and medical leave, earned sick days, and pay equity laws. But to really move the needle, we need change at the federal level, because when this many people are having the same problems at the same time, we don't have an epidemic of personal failings, we have a national structural issue that we can and must solve together. Specifically, we need to move quickly to pass the Family Act so people can afford access to paid family medical leave, the Childcare for Working Families Act, the Working Families Tax Relief Act, the Paycheck Fairness Act, the Moms Act, and the Maternal Care Act to address maternal mortality and the racial disparities that drive it. the Healthy Families Act so people can earn paid sick days, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, and the National Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. We also need to raise the federal minimum wage and, importantly, have it cover all workers, ensure everyone has access to health care coverage, including reproductive health care, make college and housing affordable, end mass incarceration, and invest in children and families, including with SNAP, WIC, the EITC, CTC, TANF, Head Start, and Medicaid, all of which inject funds into our economy. The list is long but important. These policies work for families and deliver significant returns for our economy. For instance, for every dollar invested in childcare, there is a return on investment of up to $9. You can't find returns like that anyplace else. When we update our outdated policies, we all win, each and every one of us. We can and we must make it more affordable to raise a family in America, and I know together we absolutely will make that happen. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for your testimony today. We have votes taking place both in the House and Senate. I'm going to try to get through a few of my questions, and then either Chairman Lee will be back to take over the gavel, or we'll take a real short recess, depending on how long that takes. I want to start with you, Ms. Waldfogel. I was curious, are you familiar with the two-generation approach to reducing intergenerational poverty?
Yes.
What are your thoughts on its role in potentially taking those federal policies that already exist, taking aside the need for additional policies, but better coordinating those to support the development of families and an emergence from that cycle of poverty?
I think, well, as you probably know, it's a model that's attracting a lot of interest. There's a very successful program underway in Tulsa, Oklahoma, directed by one of my colleagues, Jean Brooks Gunn, and her colleague, Lindsay Chase Lansdale. I mean, it's a win-win. So they're taking proven early childhood education programs, which really help engage parents, and they're matching those and tying them to employment and training programs for the parents, and not just random, generic employment and training, but in the healthcare sector, or, sectors where there's really a demand. We know from research that when parents are involved in education and training, their children do better in school and they do better in preschool. And likewise, obviously, children are going to do better in preschool if their parents are stably employed or in training and have more stable resources. I think we don't do enough of that. We don't do enough of thinking across programs, and it's a really promising model.
Oh, I appreciate your comments on that. I know that in New Mexico, we've seen groups like United Way and others that have really tried to pull these pieces together and act as a coordinator to support the family as a whole, have some very positive outcomes. And we've seen that in both liberal and conservative states and very different, politically different governments have real success with this approach. And it's certainly, it's something I've introduced legislation on and continue to hope to push. One of the other challenges that we have in my state, and I think this is becoming an issue all across the country, is that in New Mexico, more than 10% of children are actually being raised by grandparents. And historically, extended families have been an incredibly important part of our culture and represent a significant asset to all of our communities. But what should we be looking at within the federal government and states to make sure that as we're supporting families, we're not just thinking about mothers and fathers, especially in those cases where another family member is actually the direct child care provider to those kids?
It's a really important question. I mean, the statistics that I was reciting about, only 60% of workers having access to the FMLA, only 40% of workers having some employer-paid family leave, only 15% have access to federal child care subsidies, even though they're low-income and eligible. That pertains to parents who are entitled to these programs. Grandparents are often boxed out entirely. Exactly. So there's a lottery to get these things in the first place, but the grandparents aren't even in the lottery because they're categorically ruled out. So it's just heartbreaking because you hear these grandparents who have chosen to take on or had to take on these grandchildren and yet aren't able to get access to the programs. We really need to clean it up. under the FMLA and the various state paid family leave laws, there's a lot of variation in who counts as family, and there's a lot of debate about who counts as family. But for sure, we ought to be including grandparents, and they ought to be
Maybe we should be
entitled.
tying those benefits to the child rather, as so long as they have a
absolutely.
legitimate caregiver.
Absolutely, and same thing with the EITC, with the child tax credit.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Many of these people are literally well into their retirement years and have fixed incomes, and yet have all of the incredible burdens of trying to not only raise a child, but then after that, also help them through their education.
Yeah.
Ms. Rowe Finkbeiner, I wanted to ask you a little bit about if you could expand some on how paid family leave impacts the presence of fathers and other caregivers in the life of a child, and what impacts then come from that.
Access to paid family medical leave is a win-win-win-win for families, our business, and our economies. It's one of those true policies that just makes you want to clap and give it a standing ovation, because we see that when families have access to paid family leave, that actually, if dads take the paid family leave as well, then we see those wage gaps between women and men and between moms and dads go down. And when we have pay parity, if women had pay parity, then 50% of children would be brought out of poverty, our GDP would be increased by 3%, and we'd add more than $500 billion into our economy. So making sure that dads also have time with children actually helps moms rise. And so it's very important. When we look at some of the other countries, and we did note that most other countries have some form of paid family leave, except the United States of America, and when we look at those countries, we see that some have found that having dads have access to paid family leave is so beneficial for the whole economy, because again, when women have money to spend and are making the majority of our consumer purchasing decisions in an economy where 72% of our GDP is based on consumer purchasing decisions, then we all do better. But if we have this wage gap with moms and it's significant, then we do worse overall. So these countries, some of the other ones who've had paid family medical leave in place for longer, actually often offer a bonus package. If the dad takes leave, then the family overall would get an additional amount of paid family medical leave, because they found that it boosts the economy so much. So other things about this win-win of this policy, and again, I love this policy, is that we see that businesses are actually helped out with retention, productivity, and they have lower retraining costs. We also see that taxpayers are helped out. In some states like California, where they've had paid family medical leave for longer than others, we can see that there's a 40% lower need for SNAP and TANF, because people have that bridge moment of having those costs come in as childcare costs more than college, infant childcare costs extraordinarily high. So having that access to paid family leave at that crucial time when a new baby arrives is very important. But not to mention what you also brought up, which is the sandwich generation. We need paid family medical leave, and we need it for all workers. And we need grandparents to be able to take it, as well as parents and other family members.
So in comparing places that have instituted paid family leave, medical leave, and those who have not, there have been consistent data trends showing an actual increase in economic productivity.
Yeah, and actually, Dr. Waldvogel did the original research, which I think I found many years ago, and much to my delight, when I first found out about the mom wage gap, which is huge. Moms are making 71 cents to a dad's dollar, and moms of color, due to structural racism, are experiencing increased wage hits, with Latina moms making as low as 46 cents to a man's dollar. It's
With effectively the
outrageous.
same resume, right?
With the same resume. And we can talk about those studies, because I love those studies of two pieces of paper. And they're two pieces of paper, one resume. The only difference is that they're a mom, and the other that they're a non-mom. This was a study done by Dr. Shelley Carell, and she found that they're 80% less likely to be hired if you're a mom, and you're offered $11,000 lower starting salary, whereas dads get a wage boost. So getting rid of this wage hit when we have so many moms being primary breadwinners is so important to our families and our economy.
And does that wage gap persist even after mothers return to work?
Yes, the wage gap persists forever. And so there's policies like the Paycheck Fairness Act, which we also need to pass. And what that does, one of the important things that that does, is you can't use prior salary history to create current salary earnings so that your compounded wage hits that you've experienced over time don't determine your future salary history. But one of the things that Dr. Waldfogel found, and I do want to bring this to her because she is brilliant at this and many other things, is that there's no single silver bullet solution. We need paid family medical leave, we need affordable, accessible childcare, and we need sick days, and we need access to affordable health care. So families are crunched. We have a modern workforce, and our public policies are stuck in a time that maybe never existed. And so we need to bring up our workplace protections, our floor for workplace protections, and then we'll see those wage gaps narrow, and then we all win.
You might say there's no silver bullet, but there may be silver buckshot.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And we can do it. I mean, in the past, in the United States of America, we've passed packages for many things that have many different solutions together. We can pass packages and independently pass these laws to make the changes that we need. It's long overdue.
I want to thank you all for your testimony. We're going to take a really quick recess here for about 10 minutes while the chairman returns so I can go vote as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're now going to reconvene. Thank you for your patience, as both the Senate and the House are in the middle of votes, and I'm grateful to my colleagues from both houses and both sides of the aisle in sharing the gavel as we pivot back and forth to cast votes. We'll now begin 5-minute rounds of questions, or in my case, it may be longer than that, depending on how long it takes my colleagues to get back. That's kind of the upside of this sort of thing happening. It can result in a time period windfall for those of us privileged enough to be here. Mr. Stone, let's start with you. At the end of your testimony, you say that our laws should communicate to the citizens that we as a society, as a country, quote, see parenting as worthy, dignified, and important work, close quote. In your opinion, would our laws do a better job of communicating that message if we allowed parents to draw forward Social Security benefits immediately following the birth of a child so that mothers and fathers alike could access their own savings at such a pivotal moment?
Absolutely. I share the view expressed by several people on this panel that having our lack of any solution for leave time is a serious issue, and having the option to do it in an actuarially sound way that's not inhibiting a mother's odds of being hired, for example, because when you foist the bill onto a company, the observed effect is diminished hiring of mothers, which is not the outcome that any of us want. If you pay for it out of public coffers, then you have difficulty with passing the bill, frankly, due to essentially Where's the money going to come from? So doing it in a way that's long run, budget neutral is quite reasonable, I think, and is definitely a great improvement over what we have now in terms of communicating to parents and to potential parents that society is with them on this, that you're not doing this work alone.
Yeah, thank you. That is similar to the conclusion that I've reached. I've done a lot of work with Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa and with Ivanka Trump at the White House in trying to move that idea forward. The idea here is that this is money that the parents themselves already are entitled to. The question is, what does the government do with that money between the time that it's earned and the time that they happen to retire? It's the belief, it's my belief and that of the individuals I've mentioned, that parents ought to have the option of deciding to tap into some of that at the time they have a child. In your testimony, you speak about the marriage penalties for low-income families in our tax code and in means-tested welfare programs funded by the federal government. You conclude that, in effect, the federal government has put its thumb on the scales against working-class marriage. What are some of the most important policy fixes that you can think of that would help remove the anti-marriage bias in our tax code, in our federal welfare system?
So in the example families that I provide in my written testimony, most of the penalty that they experience comes from the earned income tax credit, as well as to some extent from SNAP and from housing vouchers or housing benefits generally. The earned income tax credit is actually procedurally a simple fix, right? Just double the eligibility thresholds if you get married. The problem is that this costs somewhere between $100 and $250 billion per year, which is, yeah, those are large numbers, right?
You're not going to fund that at couch cushions.
Nope, you're not. So to do this, there's not just a simple fix one thing, right? You'd have to step in and say, well, okay, we cannot afford the current level of generosity for single parents if we extend it in the same way for married parents. So you'd need to do a wider fix. Now, a simpler thing would be to simply, instead of having the earned income tax credit be sort of a backdoor family support program, just replace it with a simpler wage subsidy, and then also route more money through either the child tax credit or some other child-specific focused benefit. It's not clear why we would say because you have children, the government will be even more determined to support your work outside the home. We, of course, want to support people with children, but I don't think our desire to support children is necessarily contingent on them, in the case of the EITC, being unmarried and working outside the home. There's no clear rationale for this structure. So the EITC is a big one, but you see similar problems in every means-tested program. And so you'll have a similar issue with, really, you can't just change one or two thresholds. You have to statutorily, in most cases, rewrite the whole program.
Thank you. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that Congress passed in 2017 includes a doubling of the child tax credit and an expansion of its refundability to cover the payroll tax liability and counteract the parent tax penalty. In your written testimony, you wrote that a model family, Liam and Emma, trapped out of wedlock by the marriage penalties in our tax code. So this couple you described, Liam and Emma, are effectively trapped out of marriage as a result of that. You note that the only tax provision that did not penalize them is, in fact, the child tax credit. So how could this family have fared without the child tax credit expansion? And why is it important for the rest of our tax code to treat Liam and Emma with similar fairness?
So in this case, what happened was that when in this case, Emma is the one who I have as the custodial parent before marriage, and she, in claiming two child tax...
So I mispronounced that name? I thought that was an appropriate...
Was it Liam and Emma, I
Emma.
think?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I think what I just picked the most common male and female birth names of 2018 and assigned them. So,
Got it.
So she's the custodial parent for these two children, but her income, which it's a modest income. I think it's like $16,000 is what I put in. But it's not enough for her to actually get the full refund, the full non-refundable portion of the child tax credit. Now, once they get married, once Liam and Emma marry, their combined income is enough. And also because they get married and their EITC is smaller, they can sort of score more refundable on the other side because those two offset to some extent. You can't, depending on your income, you can't always get the refundability of both in the same, or the non-refundable section is offset. So in this case, actually, the child tax credit expanded in generosity when they got married because of how the non-refundable portion interacts with the refundability of the earned income tax credit. So it's sort of some thorny math. But this family, they lost money on the EITC, was their big loss, right? That Emma was getting $5,000 before. But when they get married, I believe they drop to none or virtually no EITC benefit. And at the same time, they lose some means-tested benefits on the other side, which is to say that the tax code is saying, even though you two perhaps love each other, even though you two have jobs that they're not making large amounts of money, but a couple making $36,000, $37,000, $38,000 is, there's no reason they shouldn't be able to have the American dream. Maybe they'd like to be raising these children together and would like to be married, but the tax code says, sorry, if you get married, you're going to lose $10,000.
We shouldn't be punishing them for that.
Right. We're punishing responsible decisions that I think everyone in the room thinks these people, they want this. It's not the state's job to get between them and raising their children together.
Right. Thank you. Senator Cassidy.
Chairman Lee, thank you for putting this on. This past spring, Senator Sinema and I announced a bipartisan solution. Thank you for nodding your head yes, you're familiar with it, to help working families. And I would say it's currently the only common ground paid leave plan in the Senate. I'm happy to report additional Republican and Democratic senators are now supporting and working with us on legislative text we hope to introduce this fall. Just to give background, for many dual-income families, the first year following the birth or adoption is the most expensive, and subsequent years less so. Just as the kind of context for our bill, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act bill, as was just being discussed, increased the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000. So under our proposal, the family when born, the family who has the newborn child, gets $5,000, and they pull forward that benefit from subsequent years. So instead of $2,000 in year 2 of life, they would get $1,500 and on down until it's paid back. We like it. It does not raise taxes. Payroll tax is inherently regressive, and so we avoid that. And it's no mandates upon the employer or the employee, and it does not increase the federal deficit de minimis if it does at all. In fact, I think we heard from one of you is from AEI. One thing that we learned when we did a symposium there is it may actually be beneficial to the government fisc, at least one theory, which seems plausible, because when the mother remains attached to the workplace, instead of going on public assistance, which has implications for the child and the mother long term, she remains attached, and the accumulation of seniority and training allows her wage base to grow from that point, as opposed to be brought back in and then to begin to grow. So we think it has downstream benefits for mother and child. And by the way, it also extends to parents, to a father, but obviously it's the mother who breastfeeds, for example, so we anticipate that women will use it more often, which is why I use the feminine. Ms. Wadford, if I pronounce it correctly, you're nodding your head affirmatively, so I just ask your opinion on that and any suggestions you'd have to make it better.
I have to say I'm just so heartened to hear discussion of 2 different proposals for paid family leave. So I just think it's fabulous that this is on the agenda in a really serious way and that we're having the conversation that we're having about how to fund it, because that really is the issue now. So this is a sea change from where we've been on paid family and medical leave, where it used to be, what is this thing and how should we do it? And it's so heartening that we're now in a place where we're all in agreement that new parents ought to have some period of paid leave, and we're trying to figure out how to pay for it. So I just think this is incredibly heartening. So we've heard about a proposal where people could draw down from their Social Security or people could draw forward their child tax credit. I mean, I have to say I have concerns about both those proposals because as much as I'd like to support new parents, and I think I've written about that more than anybody else over the last 25 years. So I absolutely get the importance of paid family and medical leave, but I really worry about what happens in the out years when those benefits have been drawn down. Families with 2- and 3-year-olds also need the child tax credit, as we've been discussing today. It's a huge anti-poverty program, and I'd hate to be robbing families later in childhood. Likewise, we used to have a big problem with elderly poverty in this country. We still haven't completely tackled it. Social Security is the biggest anti-poverty program we have. And so I worry about families drawing down their Social Security because they want to do the best for their children.
Just because he's already had his term, I'm going to keep on mine.
So no,
the
I've been studying there are now 8 states that have passed these payroll-funded paid family and medical leave laws. They're working really well. It's pennies per week to fund them. We've been talking to employers, including small employers. Every state we've talked to employers, 2/3 of them are supportive or very supportive of these laws. Another 10 or 15% or 20% are neutral. That means that just a tiny share of employers are opposed. The public is passing these things. I mean, legislators who are passing these are bipartisan.
I may have limited time, so let me pause. I will also say, though, that if you're going to do it through a payroll tax, that will be regressive. And it's easy to speak of that which is de minimis for someone who's more affluent, but for a working family, that so-called de minimis amount is actually significant. I'll also say, I think research shows, the more financial burden you put on an employer to employ somebody, the more likely they'll figure out how to become more productive and lay folks off. So I think that there's a little bit of a false narrative that there's no cost on raising payroll taxes for a more generous benefit. But whereas we just raised the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000, and now we're going to concentrate a portion at the family's option on the year of the child's birth, but they will still receive more than they have been receiving, seems to be something which, yes, they receive less at their option, and it's more than they've been receiving of late. Mr. Stone, you've spoken, I think, of how pronatal policies don't necessarily increase with more natal, if you will, increase fertility. Suggesting, as I gather, that a financial decision, if a child's too expensive, they choose not to have another child. But if you have, however, whatever form it takes, a child tax credit, would that be a pronatal policy?
So the research on pronatal policy making is that when countries spend money trying to get a slightly higher fertility rate, that they do get a little bit of bump, but it does cost a lot of money to get that increase. However, the most cost-effective means of bringing about some increase in the desired birth rate, the number of births women having that they intend to have, is through front-loaded benefits. That essentially giving people $10,000 up front does sort of get you, it has a larger influence on childbearing decisions than $1,000 a year for 10 years. So this is more likely to have an impact on childbearing decisions. Now, there is a question, if you are paying that up front by taking it from later down the road, I'm actually also sympathetic to the concern raised before that that family may need that money down the road. So you may front load their decision here, and then they really need the money
now, if we
more later.
Earlier you spoke nicely, or one of you spoke nicely of the interaction, but we do know that typically people have their children when they are at the kind of lower point of their earning potential.
Well, because income tends to rise over their age cycle.
Particularly, again, as I spoke earlier, if you're able to maintain your attachment to the workforce with your training, et cetera. And so I think if you will, the kind of interaction that we anticipate is, yes, you're pulling forward if you wish, but because you maintain that attachment, your salary continues to rise. And there's a little bit of a backfill that occurs from that. Also acknowledging that first year of life is the more expensive year of life. You've been, I'll take one more since the chair just took a powder. And we also would point out, by the way, that we think CBO will not score ours as being very expensive because the money is already out there. And so what they may do in Sweden would be expensive. For us, it'll be the occasional child who dies before age 10, at which point the money is forgiven, but it won't be something more than that. I'll thank you all for your time and yield back to the chair.
We're going to turn now to Mr. Heck. I'm going to go cast the final vote. I'll be right back. Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My apologies on behalf of the House members who have been overvoting on legislation. So I'm helicoptering in here without the benefit of context of what you all presented. I did have an opportunity to quickly peruse your testimony. I thank you all very much for being here. Mr. Stone, I guess I'd like to start with you. I'm certain that you've probably already talked about this, but unfortunately, again, I wasn't here. I'm fascinated by your research finding a relationship between fertility rates and home ownership. By tolerating impedimenta to home ownership and decreased home ownership as we have in recent years, do we de facto have an implicit policy of lowering our fertility rate? Is that what you're suggesting, sir?
So I don't know that it's specifically about home ownership. I think it's more about housing costs. So there are many ways to manage housing costs. It could be by buying an affordable home, or it could be by renting in a neighborhood that's very affordable. My concern is that housing costs are the one place where the amount that families spend on children is in fact being outpaced by price, where there's real solid evidence of considerable financial stress on families in the housing sector. And that is driven, there's a lot of research on this, it's essentially driven by especially local policy. Choices about land use, choices about where people can build, the codes that they build under, these sorts of things. My concern, I did not focus on that in my spoken testimony because this is largely a state and local choice. The extent to which anyone in Washington can fix this is, with all due respect to the building that we are in, somewhat limited. So it's a serious problem. There's an enormous amount of research suggesting that land use regulations and positive shocks to the price of housing, especially in the rental market, but in the owned market as well, have a negative impact on people's ability to achieve their family desires. This is a real concern. It's policy driven. But it's local policy. It's 50,000 municipalities that you need to convince to stop zoning against families.
So the correlation, the inverse correlation, is between price, irrespective of whether there's an equity position or not, and fertility.
Yes.
So I have had the privilege the last 2.5 years to chair the New Democrats Coalition Housing Task Force. And we've come away with a couple of research-based findings that I think are relevant to this conversation. The first of which is that in the last 15 years, the single largest increase in household budget has been for housing, more than health care, more than higher education. It's masked by the fact that those of us who have been in a place for a long period, a good portion of that 15 years or belong 15 years, have not experienced this. But of all major household expenditures, the cost of rent, or conversely, the cost to pay your mortgage, has gone up faster than anything else that they're confronting, number one. And number two, that this problem is materially contributed to by a lack of supply of housing stock, which of course compels people to stay renting, which drives up occupancy rates, which then drives up rents, which cause more people to be rent burdened, causes more people to require public subsidy, in fact, causes more people to be homeless. But I don't think either of those observations captures the insidious effect on the home ownership side of the deferred home acquisition by millennials. And we have measured this. It's pretty clear. The 28-year-old's more likely to be living upstairs at mom and dad's house than ever before. And why I never miss an opportunity to point this out is in an era when defined benefit pension plans are falling through the basement, people's retirement security has been diminished. And the number one asset that the average American invests in contributing to their retirement security is their home. Care to respond to my diatribe?
Yeah. So there's a lot there. So the number one asset that many families are invested in is their home. The funny thing about owning a home, see, if you own a share of a company, then maybe you get dividends, or maybe you just get a report regularly and you're going to sell it later. The funny thing about owning a home is that your dividends come in the form of not getting rained on, and then you actually have to put a lot of extra money in it. It's this company that you own a part of, but you have to buy a new roof for the company every so often, and then you have to buy a new hot water company, or you have to buy a new hot water heater for that company, and you have to keep buying all this stuff for what's allegedly an investment. Now, the problem is that when you view the home as an investment vehicle rather than essentially a form of durable consumption which depreciates, it creates an incentive to lock other people out. Essentially, it says, well, my home is an investment, so I am going to make sure that my school district remains the type of people that people who will buy my home want their kids to go to school with. My home is an investment, so I'm going to make sure that not too many other homes get built so that if somebody wants to live here, they have to buy my home. So I understand that many Americans have bought into the story that the roof over their head is also their retirement, but I would suggest that, first of all, this has not always historically been the case. Typically, your security in retirement was that you had children who would take care of you. And secondly, that this investment, this idea that the home needs to appreciate forever, it creates a toxic politic of exclusion at the neighborhood level. That ultimately, the only path forward is for a very large number of neighborhoods in America to realize that they're going to increase in quantity of houses, not in price of houses. So homeownership may be very important for the benefits it provides to a family in terms of security, but I think Americans expecting that real estate, particularly personally held real estate, will be their retirement security are going to be in for a nasty shock.
Are you suggesting that they're mutually exclusive?
There are times and places where real estate will appreciate and it will not have a negative impact on anyone else, and it's not a result of exclusion. But there is an abundant amount of research at this point that suggests that most of the really hot real estate markets in America are that way, not just because people decided that neighborhood was amazing, but because new supply is being kept off the market, generally by local regulatory choices.
But in a market where demand significantly exceeds supply,
create new supply.
It would be hard for me to exaggerate how strongly I agree with you, Mr. Stone. It is a supply issue, principally. It's not a demand issue. We're over 7 million housing units short in this country, and it creates all sorts of problems to families, many of which have been set forth here. Mr. LaHood.
Well, I want to thank the panelists for being here today, for your testimony, and having this conversation, and thank the committee for having this hearing today. Maybe a question to all of the witnesses here. Arguably, we live in one of the most prosperous times in our modern history in terms of economically and where we're at, looking at all the measurements. And yet, many people claim that having children is too expensive. Can any of you talk a little bit about what's going on there and maybe some of the reasons for that, or if there is some validity to that? Yeah, Mr. Bourne.
Well, I think we have to split this issue into thinking about how people exist with the costs that they face today and changed expectations over time. I agree with much of what Mr. Stone said earlier, in that if you look at the broad trends of costs of everyday basic goods and necessities over time and bundle up that basket of goods, actually the affordability of raising a family on fixed expectations about what you want to get or what you want to provide from your children, in most areas and for most families hasn't gone up. But over time, people's expectations rise about what they want to deliver for their children. You want to invest in after-school clubs and activities. You want to provide them with the best quality childcare available for you. So the amount that's actually spent by many families on children has risen. That's not to say that policy doesn't play a role in raising prices from what prices could be in a more market-friendly economy. And much of my research has been attempting to show that in key markets that occupy large segments of families' budgets, particularly childcare and housing costs, there are big regulatory barriers which restrict supply of new goods, such that when demand rises for childcare or demand rises for housing, there's not an adequate supply response. That manifests itself, as Mr. Stone said, in the housing market, mainly through local zoning and land use planning laws, which are particularly pernicious in many growing metropolitan areas. But in childcare, it also manifests itself through staffing regulations and occupational licensing, which many parents in upper income quartiles desire that type of improved quality from childcare, more interaction between staff and children, and better qualified staff. But when that's imposed as a policy across the state level, that has the effect of raising childcare prices and forcing many poorer families out of the formal childcare sector and into the informal childcare sector, where we have less idea of what quality is. So I guess to summarize that point, I agree with Mr. Stone that over the long term, if you wanted exactly the same expectations for your kids as 30 years ago, things have probably got more affordable. Our expectations change, and that means that over time people are spending more money on their families, and there are certain policies, particularly at a state and local level, which raise prices in those sectors.
And is there a suggested policy change to help remedy that?
Well, the main point that I made in my testimony, the two big ticket items are housing and childcare for many families with young children. And most of the positive regulatory changes that could be made would primarily have to occur at the state and local level. Now, federal government policy can push in the right direction. I may not agree with all of the current federal subsidy programs and their existence, but to the extent that we're going to have them, greater conditionality, making sure that we're not rewarding bad policy by distributing subsidies to areas that have very restricted supply sides in childcare and housing, I think is something that congressmen and women should be looking at.
Thank you. Mr. Stone, do you have any comment on that?
I agree.
Okay. Doctor, I know you only have 30 seconds here, but you want to comment?
Yeah, just I would, from the historical perspective, I think we have to just remember the sea change that we've seen in American families, and from the stay-at-home, caregiver, single breadwinner model to the dual breadwinner model or the single parent model. And so now most children are growing up with all of their parents in the labor force. And we haven't come to terms with that in terms of what that means in terms of the need for paid leave and the need for support for childcare. Childcare, even if it were less regulated, is expensive. And we really haven't come to terms with that.
Thank you.
Mr. Trone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Waldfogel, 2016, Maryland ranked 5th in the country in terms of most expensive child care. Costs an average of $14,000. In closer to D.C., it can cost $37,000. The Maryland General Assembly is working to expand pre-K, but it's still not universal. It won't be in the foreseeable future. Could you speak to the benefits for families, experience from having universal pre-K, and also the positive impact on even the higher income families?
We now have a lot of research about universal pre-K and the benefits that it offers for all children. So the benefits are largest for the low-income children, children with the least educated parents, because it helps them catch up, but it's beneficial for all kids. And it also is a very important form of child care for that year before school. But as you're indicating, universal pre-K will only cover the year before children start school, or in some states they're extending it down to a second year, and it still leaves infant and toddler years, which are the most expensive, uncovered. The federal government has a child care subsidy program for low-income and income families, but it's only funded at a level that will cover subsidies for 15% of the low-income families who are eligible. So basically, it's a lottery. If you're a low-income family, there's a lottery, and if you're lucky, you hold the winning ticket, you get a child care subsidy, but if not, you're out of luck. And that's just unconscionable.
The number I've heard as far as return on investments, 4 to 1, you think that's reasonable?
It's at least 4 to 1. It depends. With child care, it's all about the quality. So the best quality programs is as high as 8 or 9 to 1. The lower quality programs, it's less than that. So that's why we need to be careful about, proposals to cut the quality and cut the regulations, because there are two sides to that. There's the reduced costs, but then there's also the reduced benefits or even the risks of putting children in substandard child care.
Right. Ms. Rowe Finkbeiner? When we talk about the lack of affordable child care, talk about the populations that are more effective than others? And also, you don't mind speaking to, I'm a co-sponsor of the Child Care for Working Families Act, which will create some high-quality child care options all year round. And what are some of the proposals we should push forward that are those that most need it?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for being a co-sponsor of the Child Care for Working Families Act. It's an act that the members of Moms Rising, over 1 million of them, strongly support as well. As you've heard today, we hear from our members about 3 key areas of crisis in child care. There's affordability, which we're hearing a lot about right now. There's accessibility, which 50% of parents are living right now in child care deserts, so no matter how much money they had, they couldn't find child care. And then there is also excellence. So we really need, as Dr. Waldfogel said, high-quality early learning programs to make sure that every child has the opportunity to thrive. And that's where we see our strongest return on investments. Importantly, we need to make investments in childcare and early learning starting from 0 to age 5 until they get into kindergarten. So what we're seeing right here is incredible gaps in coverage. We need to start with access to paid family medical leave. Then we need to move into subsidized childcare that's real subsidized childcare that also has a career and wage ladder for childcare workers who are among the lowest paid workers in our nation. And in fact, the Child Care for Working Families Act includes components that relate to all of those. And then we need to have universal pre-K. So we need to have a whole system that includes the education of our children, because here's one thing that's important. Parents need safe, enriching places for their children to be so that they can work. Parents are increasingly in the labor force. Children need safe, enriching places to be so they can thrive in the future and be our future leaders. And childcare workers need fair pay. Just to one point that people were talking about a moment ago was about we've had increased productivity in the United States of America. And while productivity has gone up 70% in the past 30 years, actual wages have remained quite stagnant in the last couple of decades.
Where do you see the kids 4 years old, 4 years are in pre-K? Where do you see the 2s and 3s? What combination of public, private? What does that look like?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Right now we have a patchwork approach. We don't have a smooth line through childcare. And what we need to do is we need to make policies like the Child Care for Working Families Act pass. We need to look at restructuring our tax code. And we need to advance policies that allow parents to be in the labor force and make fair wages no matter where they work.
Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you very much for coming. I'm sorry we've been in and out with these vote things we have to do. I want to push back first on Mr. Bourne on the overregulation of child health care. I know it is expensive, but I'm from Virginia, and I promise you every regulation we have there was the result of some tragedy. And I've been part of this for 25 years, whether it's the quality of the people that we were hiring that weren't getting criminal background checks, or the quality of the facility, or every time some child dies, we end up trying to find a way to put the regulations in place to make it safe for all of our kids. I also, it seems to be a subset of this is pushing back against women in the workforce, which has caused all these problems. And yet, one of the things this committee pushes so hard for is the growth in GDP. And I think the post-World War II economic miracle has only been possible because of the women in the workforce. In fact, this committee in the last couple of years has pushed back a bunch on the fact that women are as a relatively smaller percentage in the workforce than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, which is one of the things that slowed down our economic growth. So to Dr. Waldvogel, one of the great points of contention is the net effect of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Do you see that it paid nearly enough attention to our lower income folks, the ones that aren't getting married because they can't afford to?
We were talking earlier about the expansion of the child tax credit that was contained in that bill, and that certainly was very important for low-income families. So I think that was a huge plus in that bill. But are you speaking of other specific provisions?
And thank you for pointing out again and again that and the earned income tax credit.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're trying to push through the House right now is a significant increase in the earned income tax credit, especially for childless individuals.
Yeah, it's very important. Childless individuals are young people who are the parents of tomorrow. They're about to become parents. Turns out that young adults are the poorest age group now in America. Who knew? I would have always thought young children are the poorest age group, but it's young adults, 18 to 24, are now our poorest age group. And that's the kind of group that could benefit from an extension of childless EITC. And of course, non-custodial fathers are another group. And we've been talking quite a bit today about the importance of father involvement and how we want to be sure that they're involved. So, yeah, we want to be even-handed in our policies and be supporting both moms and dads, and also supporting young people who are on their pathway to starting families.
Ms. Rowe Finkbeiner, Mr. Stone talked and wrote very well about the marriage penalty, that so many of our federal programs hurt you or move in the wrong direction when you get married. From a Moms Rising perspective, have you guys thought much about how you would overcome the various marriage penalty processes in our programs, beginning with the tax code?
One thing that we hear from our members again and again is that people should be able to determine who is their family and how they are raising their children. We heard earlier today about grandparents who are involved also in families and about the sandwich generation. And so the important thing to do is look at the reality of families today and make sure that we're supporting all families equitably and equally. That means in the tax code, that means in our public policies, and that means updating our outdated public policies to match our modern labor force, the fact that women are in the labor force to stay, that companies that employ us actually have higher returns coming in. So say studies, like a 20-year study at Pepperdine University of what happens when you have more women in leadership. And so we want to make sure that everybody has a chance to thrive, and we're in it in the long haul to make sure that happens.
Very good. And Mr. Stone, to toss that same question back to you on the marriage penalties, have you put together your comprehensive legislative piece for Senator Lee and for us to fix that?
Pieces of it are actually in the works, but there is an interesting case where we just heard a very large marriage penalty advanced, very well-intentionedly. We know the EITC discriminates against childless people, right? It does. It doesn't give them as equal of a benefit. But in the example tax filers that I provided in my written testimony, if both of those individual people were getting the full EITC that they would be eligible for if the childless partner was as well, the marriage penalty would be even larger. It would be another $5,000 that would be lost when they got married. So if we even things out for childless people without fixing the basic anti-marriage position that's written into the EITC, we have made the problem even worse. And this is this issue where we make policy for people as they are today, but human lives aren't static. They develop. The person who is single today is married tomorrow. The childless person today has children tomorrow. People's life situation changes, and when we don't think about that, we end up creating barriers to the life that they themselves want. So I want childless people to be treated equally, which is why I mentioned it'd be better if we just did it all through a flat wage subsidy that didn't refer to family status at all. But if we're going to have this done when you file your taxes, wow, I don't want it to be a situation where both the childless and the custodial parent get a benefit as long as they stay separate. That is not a recipe for supporting Americans of any family status.
Thank you very much. Sounds like you and Andrew Yang have been talking. So. And Mr. Senator,
he has interesting ideas.
Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. I had a question to Dr. Waldfogel to follow up. I understand there's been considerable discussion already about paid family leave, but I wanted to follow up on one aspect. I, too, will just add my voice to the chorus that families shouldn't have to make the impossible choice between earning a paycheck and spending time with a loved one who's in need or taking care of their own personal health care crisis. And it's been great to see 8 states and Washington, D.C. enact paid family and medical leave to try to address this issue. And as I think has been discussed, we all know these programs provide partial wage replacement to workers who need to care for a newborn or newly adopted child, provide care for a family member in need, or address their own health care crisis. I know there's been discussion here today about the benefits of paid family leave to the family members, but could you address a little bit the benefits for employers? What have we learned about how that really, what the ripple effect is in the workplace?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a really important one. We tend to stress the benefits for employees, and we don't talk enough about employers. Employers are they're in a tough position. They're looking for employees in a tight labor market, and so what really is valuable for them is having talent and retaining it, and what's costly for them is losing that talent. So when we talk with employers, and we've been surveying employers in states that have these laws, what they say is, even the small employers, is we give people leave anyway. We have to give them leave. Somebody is ill herself, her husband has cancer, her mother falls and breaks her hip, she has a new baby. We have to give the employee time off work. With these laws, we're able to see that they get paid, and we don't have to pay them ourselves off of our payroll.
Right.
So they're getting paid through these public, social insurance funds. And what we've also heard from employers is that in the vast majority of the times, about 85% of the time, they're covering the work by assigning it to other employees or waiting for the person to come back. So it's very rare to hire a replacement worker, only about 15% of the time. And only about 15% of employers say, I had trouble covering the work while the person was out.
Gotcha.
So it's not surprising that we're hearing that 2/3 of our employers that we're speaking to, and this includes small employers, are supportive of these laws.
Yeah.
And I have to say, when we started the survey, I was really nervous what we were going to find. And it's maybe 10, 15% are opposed. And I suppose 10 or 15% of employers would oppose pretty much any law. Right. So the fact that we're finding about 85% or 90% who are either supportive or neutral, I think is pretty impressive.
Well, thank you for that, and I think it's pretty impressive, too. It's also similar to what I've begun hearing. New Hampshire is a very small business state, and it's what I've been hearing as well. The other thing I wanted to touch on with both you, Doctor, and Ms. Rofinkbeiner, is the issue of businesses needing more skilled workers, because, again, that's probably the number one thing I hear from businesses across New Hampshire. What we also hear is that too often individuals who are underemployed or who have fallen out of the labor market entirely are not able to get the training they need for the jobs that are open, but also that they face barriers such as transportation and childcare. So either to get that training, they're having trouble finding childcare or transportation to it. So I've introduced something called and it's a bipartisan bill called the Gateway to Careers Act, which would strengthen career pathway opportunities and help individuals navigate barriers that keep too many people from participating or staying in the workforce. Through your work and advocacy, do you think we should be doing more to help families access the services they may already be eligible for and strengthen career training programs to be responsive to issues that individuals face outside the workplace?
I'll just briefly say the work that I've done on how families spend their EITC suggests to me that families are really facing very high transportation and childcare costs. So I think we've always thought that the EITC would be used for durable goods or be used for furniture for the family or maybe getting into a better apartment, addressing the housing situation. Unfortunately, families seem to be using it to pay back bills or to be paying for work expenses, primarily transportation and childcare. So yeah, anything you can do on that front I think would be fabulous.
Well, thank you. And Ms. Rofinkbeiner?
I agree. Thank you for putting forward that bill. We really see three things that need to happen. We need better, fairer wages. We need to update our outdated policies, and those policies need to be comprehensive. So when we're talking about things like paid family medical leave, we need it to mirror the FMLA, which is unpaid, in terms of not only covering new parents, but also covering people's own significant serious illness and the significant serious illness of a close family member. In fact, that's the majority of the time that the unpaid FMLA is used. So we want to make sure that that's happening. And as we update these outdated policies, we don't want to rob one program to pay another program. Families are already stretched. One thing that hasn't come up in this hearing so far is wealth inequality. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that we've had a 70% increase in productivity, but really over the last 30 years, wages have remained stagnant. That's putting us in a situation that an MIT economist has said is leading us toward a third world economic model, which is going to implode the middle class. So we need to make sure that we have comprehensive policies. And we also, to your point and to your bill, need to make basic necessities, including transportation, more affordable for families. We don't have a single one solution for what's happening in the United States of America right now, but we know that America is in crisis. We know that families want to do what's best for their children, all families. And I'm so thankful that you here today are looking at the solutions from multiple angles as well.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for letting us go over.
Happy to do it. We're always happy to accommodate those of our members who show up, especially during a busy day like this one when we've had votes. So I'm grateful to have had the participation, bipartisan participation from both ends of the Capitol. We are going to do a second round for any who are interested in it, and we'll start that now. Mr. Bourne, I want to start this round with you. In your testimony, you explained that some child care regulations, some regulations in place that affect the child care industry tend to reduce the supply of child care centers, especially in poor areas, driving up prices and reducing the rate of formal care options for families. For example, a new law in Washington, D.C. will, when it becomes fully implemented over the next few years, start to require child care providers to earn degrees, in some cases a 2-year post-secondary degree, in some cases a 4-year college degree, in other cases it might be a certification. This, of course, will inevitably have an impact on supply, which ends up having an impact on price. And expensive market-based child care appears to be a pretty widely recognized financial burden for working families. As I alluded to earlier, in a New York Times survey, 64% of those respondents who said they expected to have fewer children said that they expected to have fewer children than they considered ideal, at least in part because they believed that child care was too expensive. To what extent do you think child care regulations are responsible for higher child care costs?
It's difficult to disentangle the demand and supply factors here. So there are good reasons to think that childcare, even in a market economy, might become more expensive over time as people get richer. formal childcare is very labor intensive. It's difficult to automate in the same way that you can automate in the manufacturing sector. And for the big structural reasons that Dr. Waldfogle has talked about, there's been a big increase in demand for formal childcare over time. And of course, people tend to value their kids pretty highly. So they want a safe, loving environment from them. And for many, particularly upper income families, they want very, very high quality childcare. If you look across states, areas with the highest cost of childcare also tend to be some of the richest states, which kind of feeds into this idea that prices are strongly income elastic. Yet there is a lot of economic evidence, as I suggested, that regulations of childcare workers, in particular the number of staff required per number of children, and also occupational licensing requirements, as you alluded to, in terms of qualification requirements, do raise costs pretty substantially. There's been some academic work that suggests if you relaxed across all age groups that staff-child ratio by just one child, it would reduce childcare prices by about 10%. But actually, these regulations are particularly regressive. The best study on this has been done by two economists, Joseph Hotz and Mao Zhao. And what they did, they looked at comprehensive data and ran this econometrically. And what they found was staff-child ratio regulation in particular had no effect in improving quality. What it did do, by driving up the cost of care, was in poorer areas, it led to closure of formal centres, and that lack of availability of formal centres led to much greater use of home daycare. So there's a massive trade-off here, which is measures that people say improve quality may well improve interaction time in the formal centres that still exist within a state. But if that means that many poorer families are unable to access formal childcare, we really have no idea what happens in terms of the quality of the informal care that those people are offered. So I would say there's a big trade-off. Lots of upper-income parents want and desire these sorts of regulations anyway, but what these regulations do is strip away the choice for lower-income families to select a different price regulation, price-quality bundle. And that can have severely regressive effects in terms of access for those people to the labour market.
Other than childcare reforms, what are your other favorite policy reforms that you think could significantly lower the cost of living for low-income families?
Well, the biggest expenditure is evidently housing costs, and as I outlined, I think a key driver of housing costs in many major cities, particularly where economic opportunities are greatest, tend to be associated with overly restrictive zoning and land use planning laws. I don't think that we can really get to the nub of this affordability issue without tackling that problem. Now, evidently, that is primarily a state and local issue. But that said, the federal government, through schemes such as the Community Development Block Grants, does dish out federal subsidies to states and localities. And to the extent that those come without conditions about the supply environment, they can subsidize bad policy. So I think, I know HUD has been looking at this, trying to work out a way of making sure that states and localities have plans to liberalize their planning laws. I think that's a positive step forward. And I also think, with this rise of rent control as a potential solution being advocated, I'd like to see federal policy come with conditions that precludes those sorts of policies which would damage supply further.
Right. After a while, I suppose one does have to be careful about how far to intrude. I mean, you create one set of problems through the federal government, there's a response locally, and then we try to treat that remedy with yet another federal remedy. My time for this round has expired. Mr. Heck, you're up to bat next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rowe-Finkbeiner, thank you very much for getting to the nubbins. Better wages, especially in light of the context of 30 years of stagnant wages, because it seems to be underlying, it's foundational to all of these issues that we're dealing with. For purposes of discussion, I'm thinking about kind of three different buckets in which the federal government could take action to affect people's standard of living. And I'm going to ask you each, what is the thing that you think that we ought to do, the thing, if it were but one thing. But first, as a predicate, let me describe this. We can either through the appropriation or the tax expenditure side impact those things that are really pinching people, skyrocketing costs associated with higher ed, housing, health care, child care, or just cash in the pocket through lower taxes or EITC and the like. Bucket one. Bucket two, we can adopt those policies which lead to higher wages for at least some. Increased minimum wage. The federal level hasn't been increased in 10 years, nowhere near the purchasing power of then. More robust collective bargaining laws to favor the rights of workers. That's bucket two. Bucket three is the broader issue of just overall wages. Spirit of disclosure, this is my favorite. I believe that the Federal Reserve has pursued a policy which has suppressed wage growth. In fact, in the last 10 years, I believe, there have only been count them, 2 months in which our labor supply increased by less than the replacement rate, the replacement number in that month. 2 months in 10 years. So we really haven't had an approach to the cost of money which truly gets us to full employment. Indeed, they keep changing their definition of what full employment is. They keep lowering it. And as a consequence, we've had very slow wage growth. So I'm also reminded that what one of the chairs of the Federal Reserve once said that is my favorite observation in this regard, which is recoveries don't usually die of natural causes. They're murdered by the Fed. So we have these three buckets, and I'm interested in knowing from each of you quickly, beginning with you, Kristen, if I may. By the way, we're, as an organization with 1 million members headquartered in my home state, let me just say we're all so proud of the work you do. Thank you. But if we were to do one thing, I want to go right down the line, one thing to make a difference, what would it be? Ms. Rowe-Finkbeiner.
That's a tough question.
I know we get asked tough questions. We have to answer tough questions all the time. I'm sharing the pain.
Thank you for sharing the pain. I would actually do all three. And that is because I know that we can do more than one thing at a time. I believe we can do it. What I know is that what we shouldn't do is cut quality because we think that will cut costs. Because I just want to make sure that we look at the fact that the return on investment on all of these programs go up when we have increased quality. We were talking about early learning and childcare. So we're looking at the ROI going up as you have increased quality. So we really need to get into making sure that we're not cutting quality, we're not cutting care, and that we're moving forward wages. So if I had to pick one, I'm all three. I'm going to see how Dr. Waldvogel handles this one.
So, yeah, of course, I'm going to say all three as well, because we should have full employment, we should have higher minimum wages and stronger bargaining rights, and we should have a stronger safety net. But I'm going to say one thing.
How about not if you could choose one?
Yeah, I'm going to choose.
How about which one do you think would make the biggest difference?
Well, I'm actually going to come back to the universal child allowance, because I'm going to say with these forces sweeping our economy, children should not be suffering because of this. So we haven't even talked about the instability in the economy and the unstable jobs, people whose work hours change from week to week, and which means their earnings change from week to week. How do you pay for housing? How do you pay for childcare when your earnings are changing from week to week? So what are you doing as a parent? What you're doing as a parent is you're worrying about money all the time. So what impact is that having on your family life and on your children? So I think children ought to be protected from these kinds of forces that are swirling around in our economy while we try to sort this all out. And so, I think the child tax credit is a fabulous program in moving towards that goal. And I just think anything you can do to expand it, to make it reach more families and become more universal, I think that's what we ought to be doing when we're thinking about helping families with kids and helping people, making it more affordable to raise a family.
Thank you. Mr.
But I'm glad you're tackling the big challenges.
Well, I'm going to be more controversial and reject the premise of your question, which I think there's actually a fourth approach, which is to look at why are the costs of certain necessity goods and services so expensive at the first place, and try and expand the supply side in those areas to make goods inherently cheaper, so negating the demand for more in the way of federal borrowing, subsidies, and price and wage controls. And I think a lot of the programs that we've mentioned, no doubt could alleviate poverty. But given the fiscal conditions that you guys find yourselves in, given the limits of what you can achieve through a tight labor market, and given the risks associated with wage and price controls, I think the principle of first do no harm, examine what policies on the books that currently raise the cost of living for families and poor families in particular. I think that's a much better and fruitful approach.
Fair enough. Thank you, Mr. Bourne.
So I'm going to take the question in the spirit it was given and propose one legislative fix. However, in the spirit of Congress, it'll be a legislative fix with some riders attached. So we should take the EITC, we should repeal it, we should replace it with a wage subsidy that does not discriminate based on family structure. The EITC currently has a baked-in benefit for children. We don't want to lose that, so we should roll that into the child tax credit, which we should then expand. And because we have to have a pay-for, we should pay for it with nominal GDP targeting at the Fed, which will increase economic growth. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chair.
Anytime, anytime. I wanted to follow up on a couple of additional questions. Mr. Stone, in your testimony that you submitted to the committee, you state that the declining marriage rate accounts for at least half of the increase in the fertility gap over the last decade, and for basically all of the increase since 2000. Is that right?
That's correct.
Can you explain to us why it is you believe marriage rates are declining, and what, if anything, can be done? I was hesitating. I've got to find the right words here, because I don't necessarily want to live in a country where we've got a brooding omnipresence of a nanny state that is going to incentivize people to get married, tell them when it's time to get married. But I also don't want to live in a country where the government is disincentivizing people, where the government is artificially creating an environment in which people don't want to get married. Any thoughts on what we might be doing there?
So this idea of the fertility gap, it is rising, and it's not because people are wanting more and more kids. The amount of kids they want is about stable, and fertility is falling. But when we look at how fertility is falling, and by fertility I just mean birth rates, in fact, for a woman who gets married at a given age, her odds of having children and how many she ends up having are pretty similar to what they were 30 years ago. So this is almost entirely actually just about marriage choices. And of course, marriage is being postponed, and for working class people, it's happening less frequently at all. People with a higher degree still get married at about the same rate they always did. This has been presented in the past as a class problem, that this is, oh, there's some cultural shift happening in these different groups of people. Maybe, but it could also be that people without a college degree are far more likely to be exposed to extensive marriage penalties, that their incomes tend to be in the range impacted by that. Which then brings us to this worry about this nanny state, or maybe more like a grandma state lecturing you about getting married.
A grandma state. It's a new term to come out of.
There you go. So nobody wants this, right? Nobody's saying, I wish that the IRS would give me some advice about whether to marry my girlfriend, right? Nobody wants this. Luckily, this isn't what we need. If the problem is the marriage penalty, and I think it is, then what we really need is Probably the first step is the most popular thing in Congress, to create a commission of some kind to study where are there marriage penalties, can we identify exactly where these things occur, and once we've identified them, can we come up with some agreeable way to, probably in essentially a spending neutral fashion, essentially rewrite the eligibility and benefit rules so that we're still spending the same amount of money on essentially the same income range of people, but we're doing it in a way that doesn't discourage family formation. This isn't lecturing anybody about getting married. It's not pressuring anyone to do anything they don't want to do. It's just saying, we made a mistake in how we wrote some of these programs in the past. They weren't designed for a modern world where men and women are probably both working, and so when the eligibility threshold doesn't double, you have a serious problem. After we've done that kind of study, I think we really need a rule. That is, whenever we score a bill, we really need that scoring process to include, does this, just as a little checkbox, does this create a marriage penalty? Yay, nay. And if it does, it would be nice to know. It's not a hard thing to calculate. So just having a bit of forward guidance on this as we go forward, whenever we have a new bill that affects individuals' benefits or taxes, it should be scored. Does it create a marriage penalty?
When you explain it that way, it becomes easier to understand how that could happen, because it may be that in nominal terms, the size of the penalty might seem smaller with regard to some of those would-be couples than it is elsewhere in the economy. But in relative terms, when you think about what that does to the marginal bottom line of families right in this sweet spot where it really makes a difference, that can have a big impact on behavior. Dr. Waldfogel, I wanted to follow up on something you mentioned. You co-authored a 2016 study in which you showed that the motherhood wage gap has declined, and that even that in some cases it's been replaced with something of a wage premium for some groups of moms. Am I stating that correctly? In light of that, can you sort of discuss that finding and then tell us, does that, in light of that evidence, is it fair to conclude that the affordability crisis is necessarily driven by a motherhood wage gap, or does it indicate there could be other factors at play here?
Yeah, I've been working on the motherhood wage gap for a long time. It was part of my my PhD at the Kennedy School, more than 25 years ago.
When you were 12.
Yeah, when I was 12. Yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Prodigy. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And what I learned doing that work was women who didn't have the opportunity to take paid job-protected maternity leave often then were faced with an impossible choice. So they'd have a child, they faced an impossible choice. They didn't have enough time off to stay home as long as they needed to with their baby, and so they would leave their job and they would come back a few years later and they would start at the bottom of the labor market. And it took 10 or 15 years to get back on a par with the women who hadn't had children and were in similar jobs with similar training. So that's that motherhood wage penalty, and it lasts for a long time. Well, fortunately, we live in a world now where, although we still don't have paid family leave and childcare in all employer settings, we have it in a lot more than we used to back in those days when I was doing that research. So it doesn't surprise me that the motherhood wage penalty has narrowed over time. So we still have a problem in terms of women's earnings, but not as bad as it used to be. Of course, at the same time, other things have happened in the labor market and the education system. Women now are getting more education than men, so if there's actually a group that we're worried about in the labor market, as you know, it's the less educated men who really are taking a hit. So yeah, things have changed over time.
That's helpful. Yes. Do you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah. I just want to follow up on what Dr. Waldfogel said, and that is that it is not gone. So when we're talking about the wage gap being lowered, the 2018 numbers that were built on U.S. Census data are that moms are making 71 cents to a dad's dollar. Women overall are making 80 cents to a man's dollar, women of all races, for full-time year-round work. So the motherhood penalty, the motherhood gap, is still very significant and very, very strong. And so when we're looking at what's happening with solutions in our country, we need to address the fact that it's not just married or unmarried or type of family that you're living in that's impacting the affordability of raising a family in America. It's also wage discrimination, and that wage discrimination is compounded by structural racism. So moms of color are actually experiencing the most wage discrimination, and single moms actually experience compounded wage discrimination. According to 2018 data, single moms are earning 55 cents to a dad's dollar that is a single dad. So when we're looking at solutions, we need to absolutely look at pay parity solutions, things like the Paycheck Fairness Act. We need to look at how to raise all families. We need to look at the fact that according to Johns Hopkins University, 57% of births last year to the millennial population were to unmarried women. And we need to acknowledge that 82% of women in America do have children by the time they're 44 years old. So these solutions, if we just focus on narrow solutions, are not going to work for the majority of families. We need to make sure that the solutions that we create for all of working America, not just some, and that we don't replicate the structural inequities of the past.
Did you have your hand up? Were you wanting to respond to that? Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's worth emphasizing this motherhood pay penalty is not gone. It's very real. There's extensive research on this with really rigorous data from Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Austria, the UK, the US, and it shows that in all of these countries, there's an enormous motherhood penalty. In fact, it has almost no correlation with public benefits for childbearing or motherhood, that it's almost entirely driven by local social norms, which suggests discrimination may very well be part of it, but also suggests that our policies that we want to advance for families, we should justify them in terms of what we believe is right for families, is good for families. We should not convince ourselves that by giving paid leave, we're going to eliminate, which I think we should give paid leave, but we shouldn't convince ourselves that we're going to eliminate a pay gap that exists even in countries that have programs far more generous than anything that we're talking about. That these differentials are much harder to correct than what we convince ourselves of in political discussions. So they may be worth doing. They may be worth doing because they're good for kids. They may be worth doing because they are a good communication about what we value in parents. They don't actually address the pay gap. That is a problem that actually almost no country has found a solution to. So we should keep in mind what is possible to achieve and make sure that we don't make promises that are going to end up being lies to people that we're trying to help.
Dr. Waldvogel.
I just wanted to come back to the marriage question because I think it's a really important one. And I just wanted to say that, you know, my colleague Kathy Eden, who's at Princeton now, has done really the best research about why it is that low-income families are postponing marriage. And she tells a very compelling story about families, young men and women feeling like they need to obtain certain footholds before they can get married. They have to, you know, have completed their education. They have to have a decent job. They can't get married until they actually are stable on their feet. And so I've been thinking about the conversation we've been having this afternoon about high housing costs and young people living upstairs in the bedroom at their family's house and, you know, difficulties in the labor market and these uncertain work schedules. So, you know, I'm all in favor of getting rid of marriage penalties in public policies. We shouldn't have marriage penalties for sure. But we should think about the other things that are holding young people back from marriage. And, you know, they really need, and, you know, student debt we've been talking about. So it's no wonder that young people are delaying getting married, given that they don't have a stable place to live, they're in debt from school, and they don't have a stable job. And in some ways, we wouldn't want them to be rushing into marriage in those circumstances. So it's one of those three bucket things. It's pretty complex to improve prospects for young adults, but boy, I think it's the most pressing challenge we face today is to improve prospects for young adults because they are the parents of the future.
Indeed. Mr. Bourne, we're going to let you speak, and then Mr. Heck is up.
I guess this is probably the one area where I demur from Mr. Stone, actually, in that I'm skeptical of the idea that tax policy affects this type of behavior to a significant degree, or also that changing tax policy would lead to any significant change in fertility rates. And I say that for two main reasons. I think first because if you look across countries that have very different tax and benefit systems, there's been a similar kind of secular decline in fertility rates, which suggests there's something bigger going on about people's expectations and preferences as we get richer. But secondly, the mean age of first marriage for women is already much lower in the US than in countries such as France and Sweden. But those countries have higher fertility rates. So this is one area where I just kind of question how much of an effect tax and benefit policy really has on this issue.
That's an interesting point. Mr. Heck.
One last question, Mr. Stone. Our fertility rate is, last I checked, just under 1.8, nowhere near replacement. That obviously doesn't take into account immigration and therefore the overall population growth, but there's no question that we have been for a while below replacement. And when I think about the kinds of programs we have, like Social Security, which depend on the number of active workers in the workforce supporting the program that supports those who are retired, it begs the question about what are some of the long-term consequences of having a fertility rate which is below replacement, again, depending on immigration policy. And I suspect that there are some potentially serious implications. Would you care to just briefly enumerate some of them, please, sir?
So it would be easier to enumerate them if any of our long-term planning agencies like CBO, OMB, the Social Security trustees, if any of these agencies bothered to do a simulation that simulated a fertility rate below 1.8, the lowest scenario that the Social Security trustees even consider as possible in their most recent update on the actuarial soundness of the fund is 1.8. We're at 1.72 right now and falling. So we are beyond the worst case scenario of what any of our long-term planners have prepared for. You see the same thing in census forecasts. They overestimated the first year of their forecast. They overestimated population growth by 350,000 people in 1 year. That was a big miss. So the first step is just we should probably force our forecasting agencies to make sure that at least their first year of numbers is correct, let alone try to get a little more accurate on the out years. Now, given that we're not prepared for the demographic shift that is coming in terms of very low population growth, there will be significant consequences. We talked about housing wealth earlier. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago about lots of older Americans who've bought sizable houses in nice ex-urban neighborhoods, and they were planning to sell them for their retirement, and no one's buying them right now. Well, there would be demand.
Mr. Stone, let me just interrupt and interject something that's really important. A lot of those people want to downsize, and there is not a sufficient housing supply stock that they can get into, even if they could sell their home.
Right, so you have a problem on both sides that, one, they can't sell the home because there just isn't that much of a market there to buy it. That generation is smaller and also not as well-to-do. And second of all, the house they want to move into doesn't exist. Now, but the truth is that we think about Social Security as an intergenerational transfer. The entire economy is an intergenerational transfer. You own stock in a company that makes hot dogs. Well, guess what? There needs to be the kid who's going to eat the hot dog for you to sell it, for it to have any value when you sell it. Now, we get a little bit of a free pass because our stock market is also, through a variety of channels, open to foreign investment, that we get this nice thing where we buy goods from a foreign country, they take that money and they invest it into our securities, which is a nice handout for Americans as they grow older. But on some level, there does need to be a next generation to consume those things to protect the value of the asset. So the long-term consequence of low fertility is permanent secular stagnation. That is, it is a permanent slowdown in economic demand. We heard a lot, which I appreciated, about wage stagnation and how productivity has been growing, but wages haven't. Well, it's been better than it has been in Japan, which one reason for that is because there's been no population growth. There's been no growth in demand in the market size. There's no plausible story where investing in Japan is wise because there's not growth. What's the growth market here? So at the end of the day, what you get is you get less entrepreneurship, less innovation. You get less economic growth generally, you get less sustainable public finances. What we call in economic demography aging with dignity is very difficult. Very few countries achieve it. In the United States, especially with increasingly unhealthy aging through deaths of despair and things like that, is not well set up to handle this. We are facing a very serious issue down the road. So when we think about low birth rates, replacement rate is not what motivates me. I care about people's individual desires and lives. I'm not trying to get anybody to 2.1. If you want 3, I'd love you to have 3. If you want 1, have 1. But on some level, you do need a society that continues to have some growth in the market. Now, that can be through immigration. It can be. However, fertility rates are falling in our traditional immigrant sending countries. They're below replacement in most of the world. Beyond that, more countries like Japan are aging and saying, hey, we need immigrants. So there's more competition for those workers as well. Net migration rates in the U.S. have been falling for 3 decades. They're going to keep falling, regardless of what happens with policy. So we can't count that immigration is just always going to lift our fiscal boat. It won't. Not always.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I want to thank each of you for being here today. Your testimony you've provided has been outstanding and very thoughtful. I thank all of the members for coming and participating in the hearing as well. We think we've had an outstanding exchange. We're going to adjourn here in a moment, and as we do, I'll note for members that we'll keep the record open for a period of 3 days, should there be a need to supplement the record in writing. And we stand adjourned. Thank you.